Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 27th of November in London. I'm Caroline Hepke.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Israel and Hezbollah start a 60-day ceasefire following weeks of talks.
France's Prime Minister rings alarm bells as the country's bond risk hits levels last seen during the Eurozone crisis.
Plus, you're hired. Trump adds more names to his top economic team as talk of tariffs drives increasing unease outside the US.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Israel has begun a 60-day ceasefire with the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. The deal comes after weeks of talks mediated by the United States. While the agreement drew objections from some hardliners in Israel, President Joe Biden cast it as a step toward a broader, more lasting peace in the region.
This is designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities. What is left of Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations will not be allowed. Well, I emphasize, will not be allowed to threaten the security of Israel again. Over the next 60 days, the Lebanese army and state security forces will deploy and take control of their own territory once again. Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure in southern Lebanon will not be allowed to be rebuilt. And over the next 60 days, Israel will gradually withdraw its remaining forces.
While President Biden hailed the agreement as a major turning point, Bloomberg's US national security reporter Nick Wadhams says a ceasefire in Gaza still remains a challenge.
The intractable problem there is that Israel says it will not stop the fight in Gaza until Hamas no longer exists as a fighting force. Hamas, meanwhile, says even though it's in a vastly degraded state, it says it will not end the fighting until Israel withdraws from the Gaza Strip. I mean, those are two fundamentally oppositional goals, and so far the two sides have found no way to be able to reconcile.
Nick Wadhams' assessment comes as Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the deal would allow the country to focus on the threat from Iran. He also alluded to the strain of sustaining war on two fronts, saying, quote, the second reason to give our forces a breather and replenish stocks.
Now to Europe. Michel Barnier is warning of a storm in markets if the French government's budget proposals are rejected. Speaking during an interview with French TV channel TF1, the country's Prime Minister discussed the challenges facing the government.
An unbelievable debt, 3.23 trillion euros, a record deficit, no majority in the National Assembly, the first time since 1958, 2 weeks to come up with the budget, only 2 weeks. And so I have prepared this budget. It is not perfect, I know. We have to modify it and improve it. I have already suggested some improvements.
Michel Barnier speaking there through a translator. His survival, though, as Prime Minister depends on whether far-right leader Marine Le Pen tables a no-confidence vote in response to the budget. Le Pen has pledged to do so if her demands to better protect household purchasing power are not met. Meanwhile, French bond risk has risen to levels last seen during the euro area debt crisis amidst the political standoff.
Taxes on Britain's biggest businesses spiked even before the autumn budget. That's according to new figures from auditing firm PwC. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
A group of the largest UK companies paid £31.8 billion in direct taxes over the last fiscal period, say accountants at PwC. That's up more than 10% from the previous year, an increase largely due to corporation tax break reversals by the Conservative Party. Labour's Rachel Reeves left corporation tax unchanged in her autumn budget, but drew frustration from industry by raising employers' national insurance contributions, which made up a quarter of the direct taxes on big businesses. Ministers from both parties have avoided raising taxes directly on voters in recent years, choosing to target large companies instead. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Stellantis has announced plans to close its Vauxhall van factory in Luton, with around 1,100 jobs affected. The automaker cited the UK government's stringent EV mandate as part of the reason for the move. The firm says that it intends to consolidate its manufacturing in the UK at Ellesmere Port, where it says hundreds of workers could be relocated. The business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has described the news as disappointing.
The fact they're going to Ellesmere Port and there's going to be a £50-60 million, I understand, investment in the paint shop to do that. Of course, that bit is good news, but I wouldn't want to give any other impression than I believe this is a very difficult day for people in Luton.
The Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds speaking there. Stellantis threatened to pull out of the UK earlier this year, warning that the government's electric vehicle objectives are too ambitious as demand in Europe wanes. The UK rules require 10% of new van sales this year to be zero emission, rising to 70% by the end of the decade.
US President-elect Donald Trump has named Kevin Hassett to direct the National Economic Council and Jamieson Greer as his trade representative. Both men served in the last Trump administration, with Hassett now expected to play a key role in Trump's plans to cut taxes. And as Bloomberg's Doug Krisner reports, if Greer is confirmed by the Senate, he's likely to have a direct hand in the President-elect's aggressive approach to reshaping US trade policy.
The selection of Greer highlights the central role tariffs will play in Trump's economic agenda. He's a longtime protege of Robert Lighthizer, and he was involved in Trump's first-term trade policy decisions, including steep duties on China and the negotiations for a partial trade deal with Beijing, concluded shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic. Greer is now expected to play a pivotal role in implementing the president-elect's tariff plans, including 25% levies on Canadian and Mexican goods, as well as an additional 10% on existing Chinese tariffs. In New York, I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Radio.
Fed officials indicated broad support for a careful approach to future interest rate cuts, according to the minutes from their latest policy meeting. The US Central Bank lowered its benchmark rate by a 0.25 percentage point earlier this month, following a larger than usual half-point reduction in September. Here's Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee on what we learnt from the FOMC's November minutes.
The conditions were pretty good for the economy, better than expected in terms of growth and unemployment. Inflation had stalled out a little bit, but they still didn't think it was going to be a problem to get it down to 2%. And so rate cuts were called for.
Bloomberg's Michael McKee speaking there from the Federal Reserve in Washington. The insights come after the Fed Chair Jerome Powell said earlier this month that the US economy is not sending signals that policymakers need to be in a hurry to lower rates.
Those are your top stories on the markets. Wall Street finished another record high yesterday. The S&P 500 up by 0.6%, helped by the news of that Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. The Stock 600 had fallen by 0.6% yesterday. We're looking at Eurostoxx 50 futures pointing lower this morning. On the bond markets, the spread between French and German yields closed at the widest since 2012, moving 5 basis points wider to 86 basis points. That's over the disagreements in the French budget. In Asia today, the yen has strengthened by 0.5% against the dollar on speculation of a BOJ rate hike. The Nikkei in Tokyo down by 1%.
In a moment, we'll get the latest on the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, which has been negotiated over a number of weeks, but that has suddenly emerged. But before that, another story has caught our eye this morning. I don't know whether you've been keeping across this. There was a lot of criticism of Jaguar's teaser advert for its brand makeover. That drew loads of attention on social media, lots in the newspaper. That aside, though, our colleague Jamie Nimmo is writing about another challenge that the car maker is facing, and this is the Chinese partner Chery, JLR's Chinese partner Chery, which wants to bring its upmarket JQ brand to the UK.
Yeah, so this is going to be a sort of competing on Jaguar's home turf, really. So it has got a model which is a rival to Range Rover's Evoque, which will go on sale here in the UK next year. It's significantly cheaper, although a very similar offering for a car, and their push into the UK has come after we've had this moment around Jaguar where they've been sort of remarketing themselves to younger customers as well, relaunching the brand as all electric. Now, Chery says this isn't anything to do with the tariff threat that their Chinese electric cars are facing in the EU, by the way. Now, they offer gasoline and hybrid models on this particular, the JQ7 that we're talking about here. They say that it's part of their move ahead in all European countries at the same time. They're not worried about these levies coming in as well, but Range Rover could be facing some competition from within its own house.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is not a small brand. Chery's actually been a huge exporter for 20 years out of China. I had to watch quite a lot of videos about the JQ7, and apparently it's very good for tall people. It's quite boxy but quite high. So there you go, if you're thinking about a different brand on the market.
Perspective. OK, well, let's return to our top story now, the developments in the Middle East and this temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah that's come into effect now. Our Horizons Middle East and Africa anchor Jemana Berset joins us for more. Jemana, just talk us through what are the terms of this ceasefire?
Yes, so first of all, it is a big deal. This is the first major step to ending the regional conflict. In terms of what we know, it was brokered by the US and France. It is a 60-day truce, so a transitional ceasefire, so to speak. Lots of questions about, of course, whether it can transition into a permanent ceasefire. But the terms include Israel and Israeli troops gradually withdrawing from the southern part of Lebanon. This is going to be a phased out withdrawal, so not imminent. Hezbollah also, their part, they will have to stick to a 30-kilometer buffer zone away from the border as well, so to have no military or fighter presence or ammunition in the 30 kilometers that separates Lebanon from Israel. And then Lebanese army, thousands of troops are going to be deployed to the border as well, alongside UN peacekeepers to maintain some of the stability there. And an international panel headed by the United States will be there also to monitor compliance with the terms of the agreement. So that is, those are the components of the ceasefire. It has been welcomed by heads of state from all around the world, including, of course, US President Biden, who says also this could be the precursor to further discussions vis-a-vis a ceasefire in Gaza. And then the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu also said that they agree to the agreement, but with one caveat, saying if Hezbollah breaks the agreement and tries to rearm, we will attack.
What do you think shifted the two sides then to reach this agreement?
Well, it's interesting that the timing is happening now. I mean, you could say that in anticipation of the change in White House administration, there's been certainly a lot of pressure being put forward by the Biden administration to get this deal across the line. But from the Lebanon perspective, you may recall that we actually at Bloomberg, we had an interview with the Lebanon economy minister towards the end of September. And he at the time indicated that on the Lebanon side, Hezbollah were actually willing to engage in a ceasefire. After that, it was the same evening that Israeli forces took out Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. And so I think from the Lebanon side, there has been a desire to agree to a ceasefire for a couple of months. So then the question is, why did Israel think the timing was right now? And you could say that there is an element of war fatigue going on both sides. The economic costs of mounting fronts on multiple sides, both in Gaza and on Israel's northern border, have begun to mount hundreds of millions of dollars. In addition to some difficulty in deploying further military personnel, that is becoming a big issue domestically too. And there certainly was pressure from the international community to get a ceasefire across the line. And the more palatable option for the Netanyahu government was to de-escalate the tensions on their northern border, even though the situation in Gaza is still very present.
Well, on that point, Jemana, does a ceasefire with Hezbollah open the door to the potential of moving towards ending the conflict in Gaza as well?
I think that is the hope. And one thing that the U.S. president said yesterday is that this ceasefire between Lebanon and Hezbollah is good news, and that his administration would make a renewed push for a ceasefire in Gaza. But there is one big development that has happened in the last couple of months. And up until, I would say, a couple of weeks ago, Hezbollah were very clear at making the linkage between the ceasefire in Lebanon with the ceasefire in Gaza. The two were intertwined. And the hope from the Palestinian perspective is that if a ceasefire were to be agreed, it would be a comprehensive ceasefire for the region. And the last couple of weeks, the calculus changed. Unclear why that has been the case, perhaps on back of pressure from Iran. That's speculation from our point, of course. But in the end, what we know is that Hezbollah did agree to a ceasefire with no mention at all of the situation in Gaza. And earlier on, you were referencing some comments from our colleagues in the US. And I think what he was saying vis-a-vis two intransigent standpoints still stands. One is that Israel want to be convinced that Hamas's military capabilities are fully neutralized and will not have any sort of governing stance or governing power over the Gaza Strip once they've come to the ceasefire. And from Hamas's perspective, they don't want to have Israel to have any control over the Gaza Strip. So again, still very far apart.
OK. Jumana, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Our Bloomberg Horizons Middle East and Africa anchor, Jumana Basecci. Now, just a moment to think about what is happening in France. The risk priced into French bonds rose to the highest level since 2012 yesterday over fears that a fight over the country's budget for next year could collapse the government. The French Prime Minister has warned of a market storm if that were to happen. Stephen, you've been following this. How likely is it that this budget won't pass? Very crucial in Europe.
Well, there's still some time to go before a deal could be found. And essentially what Michel Barnier did in this interview on French television last night was lay out some of what he sees as the risk if they don't pass it. Some of these elements are not that unexpected. He has no majority in Parliament. It had almost been expected by all French political commentators that he would have to use the constitutional override to force the budget through Parliament, as the government, by the way, did before him as well. So this is something that opens the door then to the possibility of a motion of no confidence in his government. And if a majority were to be found in the Parliament that would vote against the government, that would collapse, of course, the administration as it is and leave France in a sort of limbo. And that's the storm that Michel Barnier is warning about in this interview. It really all hinges on what Marine Le Pen does, whether or not that there may be some adjustments made to the budget plan on cost of living issues, which might actually serve her agenda more specifically, and whether she can be seen to gracefully back down and not vote, because abstaining is probably the option that she's looking at politically. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.